Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, the start of a new series of episodes, one per month, on the Pentamerone. You'll pardon my poor Italian. The Pentamerone is an early collection of Italian fairy tales that was used as source material by the Brothers Grimm and Charles Perrault. It interests us for Ars Magica because its 50 stories are tied to a particular place where we've not done a lot of work. They're in southern Italy. Also, because it was written earlier and with a different audience in mind, the Pentamerone has elements which suit the Ars period better. The Pentamerone as written has 50 stories. The translation we'll be using here was made for young people during the Victorian period, so it removes 18 of the stories. I'm trying to find an out-of-copyright translation of the missing 18. I know Sir Richard Burton did one, because they tend to contain more dramatic violence and stranger magic than Taylor's child-approved 38. I will be skipping some of the stories because I can't find enough material in them to use. Others I'll be cutting out a single scene, because the rest of the story has a message that we find tedious, like princesses should obey their fathers. But the magic involved is interesting. The first 3 stories, which we'll have in this episode, are The Flea, which has a lovely monster, Cenerentola, which is a very early version of Cinderella, and The Merchant, which has a hydra roaming around southern Italy. The recording we are using is from Joy Chan via LibriVox. Thanks to Joy. My hope, once we've finished the Pentamerone, is that I'll be finished some of my other Venetian material and I can start on an even earlier collection, which was released in Venice by Straparola, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basire. Chapter 5. The Flea. Recording by Joy Chan. Resolutions taken without thought bring disasters without remedy. He who behaves like a fool repents like a wise man, as happened to the King of High Hill, who through unexampled folly committed an act of madness, putting in jeopardy both his daughter and his honour. Once upon a time the King of High Hill, being bitten by a flea, caught him by a wonderful feat of dexterity, and seeing how handsome and stately he was, he had not the conscience to sentence him to death. So he put him into a bottle, and feeding him every day himself, the little animal grew at such a rate that at the end of 7 months it was necessary to shift his quarters, for he was grown bigger than a sheep. The king then had him flayed and his skin dressed. Then he issued a proclamation that whoever could tell what this skin was should marry the princess. As soon as this decree was made known, the people flocked in crowds from all the ends of the world to try their luck. One said that it belonged to an ape, another to a lynx, a third to a crocodile, and in short some gave it to one animal and some to another. But they were all 100 miles from the truth, and not one hit the nail on the head. At last there came to this trial an ogre who was the most ugly being in the world, the very sight of whom would make the boldest man tremble and quake with fear. But no sooner had he come and turned the skin round and smelt it, than he instantly guessed the truth, saying, "This skin belongs to the King of Fleas." Now the king saw that the ogre had hit the mark, and not to break his word he ordered his daughter Porziella to be called. Porziella had a face like milk and roses, and was such a miracle of beauty that you would never be tired of looking at her. And the king said to her, "My daughter, you know who I am. I cannot go back from my promise, whether a king or a beggar. My word is given, and I must keep it though my heart should break. Who would ever have imagined that this prize would have fallen to an ogre? But it never does to judge hastily. Have patience then, and do not oppose your father, for my heart tells me that you will be happy, for rich treasures are often found inside a rough earthen jar." When Porziella heard this sad saying, her eyes grew dim, her face turned pale, her lips fell, her knees shook. And at last, bursting into tears, she said to her father, "What crime have I committed that I should be punished thus? How have I ever behaved badly toward you, that I should be given up to this monster? Is this, O father, the affection you bear to your own child? Is this the love you show to her whom you used to call the joy of your soul? Do you drive from your sight her who is the apple of your eye? O father, O cruel father! Better had it been if my cradle had been my deathbed, since I have lived to see this evil day." Porziella was going on to say more when the king, in a furious rage, exclaimed, "Stay your anger! Fair and softly, for appearances deceive. Is it for a girl to teach her father, forsooth? Have done, I say, for if I lay these hands upon you, I'll not leave a whole bone in your skin. Prithee, how long has a child, hardly out of the nursery, dared to oppose my will? Quick then, I say, take his hand, and set off with him home this very instant, for I will not have that saucy face a minute longer in my sight." Poor Porziella, seeing herself thus caught in the net, with the face of a person condemned to death, with the heart of one whose head is lying between the axe and the block, took the hand of the ogre, who dragged her off without any attendants to the wood where the trees made a palace for the meadow to prevent its being discovered by the sun, and the brooks murmured, having knocked against the stones in the dark, while the wild beasts wandered where they liked without paying toll, and went safely through the thicket whither no man ever came unless he had lost his way. Upon this spot, which was as black as an unswept chimney, stood the ogre's house ornamented all round with the bones of the men whom he had devoured. Think but a moment of the horror of it to the poor girl. But this was nothing at all in comparison with what was to come. Before dinner she had peas, and after dinner parched beans. Then the ogre went out to hunt, and returned home laden with the quarters of the men whom he had killed, saying, "Now, wife, you cannot complain that I don't take good care of you. Here is a fine store of eatables. Take and make merry, and love me well, for the sky will fall before I will let you want for food." Poor Porziella could not endure this horrible sight, and turned her face away. But when the ogre saw this, he cried, "Ha! This is throwing sweetmeats before swine. Never mind, however. Only have patience till to-morrow morning, for I have been invited to a wild boar hunt, and will bring you home a couple of boars, and will make a grand feast with our kinsfolk, and celebrate the wedding." So saying, he went into the forest. Now as Porziella stood weeping at the window, it chanced that an old woman passed by, who, being famished with hunger, begged some food. "Ah, my good woman," said Porziella, "heaven knows I am in the power of the ogre, who brings me home nothing but pieces of the men he has killed. I pass the most miserable life possible, and yet I am the daughter of a king, and have been brought up in luxury." And so saying, she began to cry like a little girl who sees her bread and butter taken away from her. The old woman's heart was softened at this sight, and she said to Porziella, "Be of good heart, my pretty girl. Do not spoil your beauty with crying, for you have met with luck. I can help you to both saddle and trappings. Listen now. I have 7 sons who, you see, are 7 giants, Mase, Nardo, Cola, Micco, Petrullo, Ascadeo, and Ciccone, who have more virtues than Rosemary, especially Mase, for every time he lays his ear to the ground, he hears all that is passing within 30 miles round. Nardo, every time he washes his hands, makes a great sea of soapsuds. Every time that Cola throws a bit of iron on the ground, he makes a field of sharp razors. Whenever Micco flings down a little stick of tangled wood springs up. If Petrulla lets fall a drop of water, it makes a terrible river. When Ascadeo wishes a strong tower to spring up, he has only to throw a stone. And Ciccone shoots so straight with the crossbow that he can hit a hen's eye a mile off. Now with the help of my sons, who are all courteous and friendly, and who will all take compassion on your condition, I will contrive to free you from the claws of the ogre." "No time better than now," replied Porziella, "for that evil shadow of a husband of mine has gone out and will not return this evening, and we shall have time to slip off and run away." "It cannot be this evening," replied the old woman, "for I live a long way off. But I promise you that to-morrow morning I and my sons will all come together and help you out of your trouble." So saying, the old woman departed, and Porziella went to rest with a light heart and slept soundly all night. But as soon as the birds began to cry, "Long live the sun!" lo and behold, there was the old woman with her 7 children, and placing Porziella in the midst of them, they proceeded towards the city. But they had not gone above half a mile when Mase put his ear to the ground and cried, "Hallo, have a care! Here's the fox. The ogre is come home. He has missed his wife, and he is hastening after us with his cap under his arm." No sooner did Nardo hear this than he washed his hands and made a sea of soap-suds. And when the ogre came and saw all the suds, he ran home, and fetching a sack of bran, he strewed it about, and worked away treading it down with his feet, until at last he got over this obstacle, though with great difficulty. But Mase put his ear once more to the ground, and exclaimed, "Look sharp, Conrad, here he comes!" Thereupon Cola flung a piece of iron on the ground, and instantly a field of razors sprang up. When the ogre saw the path stopped, he ran home again, and clad himself in iron from head to foot, and then returned and got over this peril. Then Mase, again putting his ear to the ground, cried, "Up, up, to arms, to arms! For see, here is the ogre coming at such a rate that he is actually flying." But Micco was ready with his little stick, and in an instant he caused a terrible wood to rise up, so thick that it was quite impenetrable. When the ogre came to this difficult pass, he laid hold of a Carrara knife which he wore at his side, and began to cut down the poplars and oaks and pine trees and chestnut trees right and left, so that with 4 or 5 strokes he had the whole forest on the ground, and got clear of it. Presently Mase, who kept his ears on the alert like a hare, again raised his voice and cried, "Now we must be off, for the ogre is coming like the wind, and here he is at our heels." As soon as Petrullo heard this, he took water from a little fountain, sprinkled it on the ground, and in a twinkling of an eye a large river rose up on the spot. When the ogre saw this new obstacle, and that he could not make holes so fast as they found bungs to stop him, he stripped himself stark naked, and swam across to the other side of the river with his clothes upon his head. Mase, who put his ear to every chink, heard the ogre coming, and exclaimed, "Alas, matters go ill with us now! I already hear the clatter of the ogre's heels. We must be on our guard and ready to meet the storm, or else we are done for." "Never fear," said Ascaddeo, "I will soon settle this ugly ragamuffin." So saying, he flung a pebble on the ground, and instantly up rose a tower in which they all took refuge without delay, and barred the door. But when the ogre came up, and saw that they had got into so safe a place, he ran home, got a vine-dresser's ladder, and carried it back on his shoulder to the tower. Now Mase, who kept his ears hanging down, heard at a distance the approach of the ogre, and cried, "We are now at the butt end of the candle of hope. Ceccone is our last resource, for the ogre is coming back in a terrible fury. Alas, how my heart beats, for I foresee an evil day." "You coward," answered Ceccone, "trust to me, and I will hit him with a ball." As Ceccone was speaking, the ogre came, planted his ladder, and began to climb up. But Ceccone, taking aim at him, shot out one of his eyes, and laid him at full length on the ground, like a pear dropped from a tree. Then he went out of the tower, and cut off the ogre's head with a big knife he carried about with him, just as if it had been new-made cheese. Thereupon they took the head with great joy to the king, who rejoiced at the recovery of his daughter, for he had repented 100 times at having given her to an ogre. And not many days after, Porziella was married to a handsome prince, and the 7 sons and their mother who had delivered her from such a wretched life were rewarded with great riches.
The 7 sons each have a magical power, which could be shown as a virtue, although some of them are beyond the scale of the usual as magical powers. For example, throwing a stone and building a tower is unusual. They don't seem to be fairies because they want human riches, but they are nonetheless now tied into this family's story, so they could be some sort of family guardian spirits henceforth. This gives me an enormous amount of standing up to do. The monster that I mentioned before that I love is the flea, but we also have a cannibal giant, and each of the 7 powers, if not the 7 individuals who have them. These will, once again, get added to the enormous backlog of characters that will eventually turn up in Half-Forgotten Monsters.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile. Chapter 6. Cenerentola. Recording by Joy Chan. In the sea of malice, envy frequently gets out of her depth, and, while she is expecting to see another drowned, she is either drowned herself or is dashed against a rock, as happened to some envious girls about whom I will tell you a story. There once lived a prince who was a widower. He had an only daughter so dear to him that he saw with no other eyes than hers, and he kept a governess for her, who taught her chain-work and knitting, and to make point-lace, and showed her such affection as no words can tell. But she was very lonely, and many a time she said to the governess, "Oh, that you had been my mother, you who show me such kindness and love." And she said this so often that, at last, the governess, having a bee put into her bonnet, said to her one day, "If you will do as this foolish head of mine advises, I shall be mother to you, and you will be as dear to me as the apple of my eye." She was going to say more when Zezolla, for that was the name of the princess, said, "Pardon me if I stop the word upon your tongue. I know you wish me well, therefore, hush, enough. Only show me the way. Do you write, and I will subscribe." "Well, then," answered the governess, "open your ears and listen, and you will get bread as white as the flowers. You know well enough that your father would even coin false money to please you. So do you entreat him, when he is caressing you, to marry me and make me princess. Then, bless your stars, you shall be the mistress of my life." When Zezolla heard this, every hour seemed to her 1,000 years, until she had done all that her governess had advised. And as soon as the mourning for her mother's death was ended, she began to feel her father's pulse, and beg him to marry the governess. At first the prince took it as a joke, but Zezolla went on shooting so long past the mark that at length she hit it, and he gave way to her entreaties. So he married the governess, and gave a great feast at the wedding. Now, while the young folks were dancing, and Zezolla was standing at the window of her house, a dove came flying, and perched upon a wall, and said to her, "Whenever you need anything, send the request to the dove of the fairies in the island of Sardinia, and you will instantly have what you wish." For 5 or 6 days the new stepmother overwhelmed Zezolla with caresses, seating her at the best place at table, giving her the choicest morsels to eat, and clothing her in the richest apparel. But ere long, forgetting entirely the good service she had received, woe to him who has a bad master, she began to bring forward 6 daughters of her own, for she had never before told any one that she was a widow with a bunch of girls. And she praised them so much, and talked her husband over in such a fashion, that at last the stepdaughters had all his favour, and the thought of his own child went entirely from his heart. In short, it fared so ill with the poor girl, bad to-day and worse to-morrow, that she was at last brought down from the royal chamber to the kitchen, from the canopy of state to the hearth, from splendid apparel of silks and gold to dish-clouts, from the sceptre to the spit. And not only was her condition changed, but even her name, for instead of Zezolla, she was now called Cenerentola. It happened that the prince had occasion to go to Sardinia upon affairs of state, and, calling the 6 stepdaughters, he asked them, one by one, what they would like him to bring them on his return. Then one wished for splendid dresses, another to have head ornaments, another rouge for the face, another toys and trinkets. One wished for this and one for that. At last the prince said to his own daughter, as if in mockery, "And what would you have, child?" "Nothing, father," she replied, "but that you would commend me to the dove of the fairies, and bid her send me something. And if you forget my request, may you be unable to stir backwards or forwards. So remember what I tell you, for it will fare with you accordingly." Then the prince went his way, and did his business in Sardinia, and procured all the things that his stepdaughters had asked for. But poor Zezolla was quite out of his thoughts, and going on board a ship he set sail to return. But the ship could not get out of the harbour. There it stuck fast, just as if held by a sea lamprey. the captain of the ship, who was almost in despair and fairly tired out, laid himself down to sleep, and in his dream he saw a fairy who said to him, "Know you the reason why you cannot work the ship out of port? It is because the prince who is on board with you has broken his promise to his daughter, remembering everyone except his own child." Then the king awoke and told his dream to the prince, who, in shame and confusion at the breach of his promise, went to the grotto of the fairies, and, commending his daughter to them, asked them to send her something. And behold, there stepped forth from the grotto a beautiful maiden, who told him that she thanked his daughter for her kind remembrances, and bade him tell her to be merry and of good heart out of love to her. And thereupon she gave him a date tree, a hoe, and a little bucket all of gold, and a silken napkin, adding that the one was to hoe with, and the other to water the plant. The prince, marvelling at this present, took leave of the fairy and returned to his own country, and when he had given his stepdaughters all the things they had desired, he at last gave his own daughter the gift which the fairy had sent her. Then Zezolla, out of her wits with joy, took the date tree and planted it in a pretty flower pot, hoed the earth round it, watered it, and wiped its leaves morning and evening with the silken napkin. In a few days it had grown as tall as a woman, and out of it came a fairy, who said to Zezolla, "What do you wish for?" And Zezolla replied that she wished sometimes to leave the house without her sister's knowledge. The fairy answered, "Whenever you desire this, come to the flower pot and say, 'My little date tree, my golden tree, with a golden hoe I have hoed thee, with a golden can I have watered thee, with a silken cloth I have wiped thee dry. Now strip thee and dress me speedily.' And when you wish to undress, change the last words and say, 'Strip me and dress thee.'" When the time for the feast was come, and the stepmother's daughters appeared, dressed out so fine, all ribbons and flowers, and slippers and shoes, sweet smells and bells, and roses and posies, Zezolla ran quickly to the flower pot, and no sooner had she repeated the words, as the fairy had told her, than she saw herself arrayed like a queen, seated upon a palfrey, and attended by 12 smart pages, all in their best clothes. Then she went to the ball, and made the sisters envious of this unknown beauty. Even the young king himself was there, and as soon as he saw her he stood magic-bound with amazement, and ordered a trusty servant to find out who was that beautiful maiden, and where she lived. So the servant followed in her footsteps, but when Zezolla noticed the trick, she threw on the ground a handful of crown pieces, which she had made the date tree give her for this purpose. Then the servant lighted his lantern, and was so busy picking up all the crown pieces that he forgot to follow the palfrey. And Zezolla came home quite safely, and changed her clothes, as the fairy told her, before the wicked sisters arrived, and, to vex her and make her envious, told her of all the fine things they had seen. But the king was very angry with the servant, and warned him not to miss finding out next time who this beautiful maiden was, and where she dwelt. Soon there was another feast, and again the sisters all went to it, leaving poor Zezolla at home on the kitchen hearth. Then she ran quickly to the date tree, and repeated the spell, and instantly there appeared a number of damsels, one with a looking-glass, another with a bottle of rose-water, another with the curling-irons, another with combs, another with pins, another with dresses, and another with capes and collars. And they decked her out as glorious as the sun, and put her in a coach drawn by 6 white horses, and attended by footmen and pages in livery. And no sooner did she appear in the ballroom than the hearts of the sisters were filled with amazement, and the king was overcome with love. When Zezolla went home the servant followed her again, but so that she would not be caught she threw down a handful of pearls and jewels, and the good fellow, seeing that they were not things to lose, stayed to pick them up. So she had time to slip away and take off her fine dress as before. Meanwhile the servant had returned slowly to the king, who cried out when he saw him, "By the souls of my ancestors, if you do not find out who she is, you shall have such a thrashing as was never before heard of, and as many kicks as you have hairs in your beard." When the next feast was held, and the sisters were safely out of the house, Zezolla went to the date tree, and once again repeated the spell. In an instant she found herself splendidly arrayed and seated in a coach of gold, with ever so many servants around her, so that she looked just like a queen. Again the sisters were beside themselves with envy, but this time when she left the ballroom, the king's servant kept close to the coach. Zezolla, seeing that the man was ever running by her side, cried, "Coachman, drive on quickly!" And in a trice the coach set off at such a rattling pace that she lost one of her slippers, the prettiest thing that ever was seen. The servant, being unable to catch the coach, which flew like a bird, picked up the slipper, and carrying it to the king, told him all that had happened. Whereupon the king, taking it in his hand, said, "If the basement indeed is so beautiful, what must the building be? You who until now were the prison of a white foot, are now the fetter of an unhappy heart." Then he made a proclamation that all the women in the country should come to a banquet, for which the most splendid provision was made of pies and pastries, and stews and ragouts, macaroni and sweetmeats, enough to feed a whole army. And when all the women were assembled, noble and ignoble, rich and poor, beautiful and ugly, the king tried the slipper on each one of the guests, to see whom it should fit to a hair, and thus be able to discover, by the help of the slipper, the maiden of whom he was in search, but not one foot could he find to fit it. So he examined them closely whether indeed every one was there, and the prince confessed that he had left one daughter behind. "But," said he, "she is always on the hearth, and is such a graceless simpleton that she is unworthy to sit and eat at your table." But the king said, "Let her be the very first on the list, for so I will." So all the guests departed. The very next day they assembled again, and with the wicked sisters came Zezolla. When the king saw her, he had his suspicions, but said nothing. And after the feast came the trial of the slipper, which, as soon as ever it approached Zezolla's foot, it darted on to it of its own accord, like iron flies to the magnet. Seeing this, the king ran to her and took her in his arms, and seating her under the royal canopy, he set the crown upon her head, whereupon all made their obeisance and homage to her as their queen. When the wicked sisters saw this, they were full of venom and rage, and, not having patience to look upon the object of their hatred, they slipped quietly away on tiptoe, and went home to their mother, confessing, in spite of themselves, that he is a madman who resists the stars. End of chapter 6.
Geographically, it's interesting to know that Sardinia, which has previously been a not particularly well documented island in Ars Magica, is the home to fairies who grant these sorts of wishes. Trees that have fairies emerge from them, like the fairies who emerge from the date tree here, are a repeated trope in the Pentamerone. The first story, The Hazel, has something similar. I'd note that when he says the boat can't leave as if it's held by a sea lamprey, that's because people believe that certain tiny eels, when they are attached to the heels of boats, would prevent those boats from being able to move through the water. Again, statistics required for the wish-granting fairies. Strangely enough, Ars Magica already has statistics for sea lampreys. I also like that her shoes, which aren't made of glass, that was by Charles Perrault and is probably a translation error, are magnetic. They fly back to her foot.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Pesire. Chapter 7. The Merchant. Troubles are usually the brooms and shovels that smooth the road to a man's good fortune, of which he little dreams. Many a man curses the rain that falls upon his head, and knows not that it brings abundance to drive away hunger, as is seen in the person of a young man of whom I will tell you. It is said that there was once a very rich merchant named Antoniello, who had a son called Cienzo. It happened that Cienzo was one day throwing stones on the seashore with the son of the King of Naples, and by chance broke his companion's head. When he told his father, Antoniello flew into a rage with fear of the consequences, and abused his son. But Cienzo answered, "Sir, I have always heard say that better is the law court than the doctor in one's house. Would it not have been worse if he had broken my head? It was he who began and provoked me. We are but boys, and there are two sides to the quarrel. After all, 'tis a first fault, and the king is a man of reason. But let the worst come to the worst. What great harm can he do me? The wide world is one's home, and let him who is afraid turn constable. But Antoniello would not listen to reason. He made sure the king would kill Cienzo for his fault, and said, "Don't stand here at risk of your life, but march off this very instant, so that nobody may hear a word, new or old, of what you have done. A bird in the bush is better than a bird in the cage. Here is money. Take one of the 2 enchanted horses I have in the stable, and the dog which is also enchanted, and tarry no longer here. It is better to scamper off and use your own heels than to be touched by another's. Better to throw your legs over your back than to carry your head between 2 legs. If you don't take your knapsack and be off, none of the saints can help you." Then, begging his father's blessing, Cienzo mounted his horse, and tucking the enchanted dog under his arm, he went his way out of the city. Making a winter of tears with a summer of sighs, he went his way until the evening, when he came to a wood that kept the Mule of the Sun outside its limits, while it was amusing itself with silence and the shades. An old house stood there, at the foot of a tower. Cienzo knocked at the door of the tower, but the master, being in fear of robbers, would not open to him. So the poor youth was obliged to remain in the ruined old house. He turned his horse out to graze in a meadow, and threw himself on some straw he found, with the dog by his side. But scarcely had he closed his eyes, when he was awakened by the barking of the dog, and heard footsteps stirring in the house. Cienzo, who was bold and venturesome, seized his sword, and began to lay about him in the dark. But perceiving that he was only striking the wind and hit no one, he turned round again to sleep. After a few minutes he felt himself pulled gently by the foot. He turned to lay hold again of his cutlass, and jumping up exclaimed, "Hullo there! You are getting too troublesome. But leave off this sport, and let's have a bout of it if you have any pluck, for you have found the last to your shoe." At these words he heard a shout of laughter, and then a hollow voice saying, "Come down here, and I will tell you who I am." Then Cienzo, without losing courage, answered, "Wait a while, I'll come." So he groped about until at last he found a ladder which led to a cellar, and going down he saw a lighted lamp, and 3 ghost-looking figures, who were making a piteous clamour, crying, "Alas, my beauteous treasure, I must lose thee!" When Cienzo saw this, he began himself to cry and lament for company's sake, and after he had wept for some time, the moon having now, with the axe of her rays, broken the bar of the sky, the 3 figures who were making the outcry said to Cienzo, "Take this treasure, which is destined for thee alone, but mind and take care of it." Then they vanished. And Cienzo, espying the sunlight through a hole in the wall, wished to climb up again, but could not find the ladder, whereat he set up such a cry that the master of the tower heard him and fetched a ladder, when they discovered a great treasure. He wished to give part of it to Cienzo, but the latter refused, and taking his dog and mounting once more on his horse, set out again on his travels. After a while he arrived at a wild and dreary forest, so dark that it made you shudder. There, upon the bank of a river, he found a fairy surrounded by a band of robbers. Cienzo, seeing the wicked intention of the robbers, seized his sword and soon made a slaughter of them. The fairy showered thanks upon him for this brave deed done for her sake, and invited him to her palace that she might reward him. But Cienzo replied, "It is nothing at all, thank you kindly. Another time I will accept the favour, but now I am in haste on business of importance." So saying he took his leave, and travelling on a long way, he came at last to the palace of a king, which was all hung with mourning, so that it made one's heart black to look at it. When Cienzo inquired the cause of the mourning, the folks answered, "A dragon with 7 heads has made his appearance in this country, the most terrible monster that ever was seen, with the crest of a cock, the head of a cat, eyes of fire, the mouth of a bulldog, the wings of a bat, the claws of a bear, and the tail of a serpent. Now this dragon swallows a maiden every day, and now the lot has fallen on Menechella, the daughter of the king. So there is great weeping and wailing in the royal palace, since the fairest creature in all the land is doomed to be devoured by this horrid beast." When Cienzo heard this, he stepped aside and saw Menechella pass by with the mourning train, accompanied by the ladies of the court and all the women of the land, wringing their hands and tearing out their hair by handfuls, and bewailing the sad fate of the poor girl. Then the dragon came out of the cave, but Cienzo laid hold of his sword and struck off a head in a trice. But the dragon went and rubbed his neck on a certain plant which grew not far off, and suddenly the head joined itself on again, like a lizard joining itself to its tail. Cienzo, seeing this, exclaimed, "He who dares not, wins not," and, setting his teeth, he struck such a furious blow that he cut off all 7 heads, which flew from the necks like peas from the pan. Whereupon he took out the tongues, and putting them in his pocket, he flung the heads a mile apart from the body, so that they might never come together again. Then he sent Menechella home to her father, and went himself to repose in a tavern. When the king saw his daughter, his delight is not to be told, and having heard the manner in which she had been freed, he ordered a proclamation to be instantly made, that whosoever had killed the dragon should come and marry the princess. Now a rascal of a country fellow, hearing this proclamation, took the heads of the dragon and said, "Menechella has been saved by me. These hands have freed the land from destruction. Behold the dragon's heads, which are the proofs of my valour. Therefore recollect, every promise is a debt." As soon as the king heard this, he lifted the crown from his own head and set it upon the countryman's pole, who looked like a thief on the gallows. The news of this proclamation flew through the whole country, till at last it came to the ears of Cienzo, who said to himself, "Verily I am a great blockhead. I had hold of Fortune by the forelock, and I let her escape out of my hand. Here's a man offers to give me the half of a treasure he finds, and I care no more for it than a German for cold water. The fairy wishes to entertain me in her palace, and I care as little for it as an ass for music. And now that I am called to the crown, here I stand and let a rascally thief cheat me out of my trump card." So saying, he took an inkstand, seized a pen, and spreading out a sheet of paper, began to write. To the most beautiful jewel of women, Menechella, having by the favour of Sol and Leo saved thy life, I hear that another plumes himself with my labours, that another claims the reward of the service which I rendered. Thou, therefore, who wast present at the dragon's death, canst assure the king of the truth, and prevent his allowing another to gain this reward while I have had all the toil. For it will be the right effect of thy fair royal grace, and the merited recompense of this strong hero's fist. In conclusion, I kiss thy delicate little hands. From the Inn of the Flower Pot, Sunday. Having written this letter and sealed it with a wafer, he placed it in the mouth of the enchanted dog, saying, "Run off as fast as you can, and take this to the king's daughter. Give it to no one else, but place it in the hand of that silver-faced maiden herself." Away ran the dog to the palace as if he were flying, and going up the stairs he found the king, who was still paying compliments to the country clown. When the man saw the dog with the letter in his mouth, he ordered it to be taken from him. But the dog would not give it to any one, and bounding up to Menechella he placed it in her hand. Then Menechella rose from a seat, and making a curtsy to the king, she gave him the letter to read. And when the king had read it, he ordered that the dog should be followed to see where he went, and that his master should be brought before him. So 2 of the courtiers immediately followed the dog, until they came to the tavern, where they found Cienzo. And, delivering the message from the king, they conducted him to the palace, into the presence of the king. Then the king demanded how it was that he boasted of having killed the dragon, since the heads were brought by the man who was sitting crowned at his side. And Cienzo answered, "That fellow deserves a pasteboard mitre rather than a crown, since he has had the impudence to tell you a bouncing lie. But to prove to you that I have done the deed and not this rascal, order the heads to be produced. None of them can speak to the proof without a tongue, and these I have brought with me as witnesses to convince you of the truth." So saying, he pulled the tongues out of his pocket, while the countryman was stuck all of a heap, not knowing what would be the end of it. And the more so when Menechella added, "This is the man! Ah, you dog of a countryman, a pretty trick you have played me!" When the king heard this, he took the crown from the head of that false loon, and placed it on the head of Cienzo. And he was on the point of sending the impostor to the galleys, but Cienzo begged the king to have mercy on him, and to confound his wickedness with courtesy. Then he married Menechella, and the tables were spread, and a royal banquet was set forth. And in the morning they sent for Antoniello with all his family. And Antoniello soon got into great favour with the king, and saw in the person of his son the saying verified, "A straight port to a crooked ship." End of chapter 7.
This episode's gone on a little longer than I expected it to, so I won't belabour things too much here. Beyond saying that I've finally found a way of reskinning the statistics for a character that turned up in Realms of Power Fairy, which, it being published so long ago, is clearly based on Timothy the dog from Enid Blyton's famous 5 stories. In addition to that, of course, we have a 7-headed dragon. Strangely enough, in ours, 7-headed dragons are quite easy to stat because we've already got examples of them. So having blown out the list of creatures to be statted to an even greater extreme, let us now bid farewell to the Pentamerone for a month. Your saga may vary.